Okay, very good. I can hear you, Rafi Gregorian. Thank you. Excellent. Good evening. My name is Mark Mamagonian. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs at the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, and I would like to welcome you tonight to the second annual Nasser Vartan Gregorian Memorial Lecture. In remembering and honoring Vartan Gregorian at this time, it's also important for us to remember and honor Edward Avedissian, who passed away in December of last year. It was Ed, a Nasser board member and benefactor and the lead donor of Nasser's headquarters building, who insisted that the building should bear the name of Vartan Gregorian and not the name of Edward Avedissian. Ed said, quote, Vartan Gregorian embodies the values at the heart of Nasser's mission. He dedicated his entire life to educational advancement and the pursuit of knowledge, engaging in public service throughout his career and working to better the human condition. So as I speak these words, I can turn to my left and see the plaque showing both of them, Ed and Vartan, each richly deserving to be remembered with our respect and affection. Vartan Gregorian was born in Tabriz, Iran in 1934, and he passed away on April 15th, 2021. Vartan was a brilliant educator, humanitarian, and friend, after whom, of course, this building is named. He received his secondary education at the Collège Arménien in Beirut, Lebanon. He graduated and received a PhD in history and humanities from Stanford University. Among his publications are the important work, The Emergence of Modern Afghanistan, Politics of Reform and Modernization, 1880 to 1946, and the engaging memoir, The Road to Home, My Life and Times. After an academic career spanning 2 decades, including a period as Tarzian Professor of Armenian and Caucasian History at the University of Pennsylvania, he served as President of the New York Public Library, President of Brown University, and President of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. We're very fortunate to have with us tonight via Zoom, Dr. Rafi Gregorian, one of the sons of Vartan and Claire Gregorian, and a highly distinguished scholar and diplomat in his own right, the deputy to the Undersecretary General and Director at the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism. Rafi, thank you for making time to join us tonight, and let's see if we can do this.
Something now?
I think so, Rafi, yes.
Yes?
Yes, please.
Go? All right. Can I get started?
Yes, please.
All right. First of all, I doubt that the wait was worth it, but thank you, Mark, for the privilege to make a few opening remarks to what promises to be an amazing lecture. I'm really sorry that my overly frequent travels for the UN precluded my being there in person tonight. I've only ever seen the center when it was under construction, and sadly, I was unable to make the opening. But I do plan to retire to Massachusetts, and I certainly hope to make frequent visits to the Vartan Gregorian Center when I do. Look, I'll be very brief, as we all want to hear from Andrew Meier about this book. It's been just a few short 6 months, as you noted, since Ed Avedissian passed away, and it's been 2 years since my father died. We laid him to rest on Armenian Martyrs' Day in 2021. The same day President Biden issued his historic statement about the Armenian genocide. Both my father and Mr. Avedissian believed in the power of education to uplift both individuals and their communities. In addition to their many contributions to institutes of higher learning, both men had schools named after them. The Avedissian School in Yerevan, which my father was able to visit on his last trip to Armenia, and the Vartan Gregorian Elementary School in Providence. It was, as you noted, Mr. Avedissian who insisted the center be named after my father. Although it took some doing, my father noted during the opening of the center that of all the honors he had received, being the namesake of the elementary school and this center that you're in tonight were the two that meant the most to him. And I'm very glad that my cousin Ara Kellian was able to help arrange for most of my father's Armenian books to find their way to the center there in Belmont. Now, if I could, just a few words about Ambassador Henry Morgenthau. His efforts to bear witness to and rouse the world to action in defense of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire were an early source of inspiration for my own life of public service, of defending the defenseless and giving a voice to the voiceless. His cable of July 16, 1915, from Constantinople to Washington, this is not the original, by the way, in which he warns of a campaign of race extermination in progress under a pretext of reprisal against rebellion, for which nothing short of actual force would adequately meet the situation, was in the back of my own head when, in my first month as a State Department official, I wrote Secretary Albright's briefing memo for the January 1999 NSC meeting that would lead to the NATO air campaign to stop and reverse Milosevic's ethnic cleansing of Kosovar Albanians. Like Morgenthau, who listened and recorded eyewitness accounts of the mass murder of Armenians, I had to field emotionally wrenching calls from international observers relaying by satellite phone in real time the atrocities unfurling in front of them. The difference was that this time, the United States employed actual force and saved some 1 million people from extermination. So we should all be indebted to Ambassador Morgenthau for showing the way. I know I am as a diplomat. Thank you very much, and I really look forward to the lecture and am honored to have been asked to make a few opening remarks. Thank you.
If you can hear me, Rafi, thank you. Okay, now we will make the transition back. Am I back on? Thank you that I am. Let us now turn to tonight's program. The second Nasser lecture bearing Vartan Gregorian's name is a particularly timely and relevant and an important one. A few years ago, when I heard about Andrew Meier's just published book, Morgenthau, Power, Privilege, and the Rise of an American Dynasty, it struck me as a very good fit for the Gregorian lecture. For the Morgenthau story is a story of immigrants, it's a story of diplomacy, and it is also very much a New York story. Needless to say, for this audience, I think, anyway, it is also in part an Armenian story, given Henry Morgenthau's central role as U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, as well as a Holocaust story, due to the important part played by Henry Morgenthau Jr. during World War II. There is, of course, a lot more in this extraordinary and deeply researched and thick book, which, by the way, is on sale this evening at a 15% discount for everyone, in person and online, for one night only. And I'm sure the author will take pleasure in signing it for you. The author, Andrew Meier, is also the author of Black Earth, A Journey Through Russia After the Fall, and The Lost Spy, an American in Stalin's Secret Service, the former Moscow correspondent for Time. He's contributed to the New York Times Magazine, among other publications, for more than 2 decades. His work has been recognized with fellowships from the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library and the Leon Levy Center for Biography, as well as the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, with his family. Please use the Zoom Q&A function, those of you on Zoom, to ask questions of our speaker, and following their presentation, I will moderate the discussion. And we now welcome Mr. Andrew Meier.
We're good? Okay, thank you. Thank you all for coming on this beautiful night in Boston. Gorgeous evening here. I don't know what it's like in New York, Rafi. And it was most certainly worth the wait. I learned a lot, and it was a fantastic introduction. And I see we already have 6 questions, so I better get to it. It is an honor for me. I was pleased to hear Rafi say what an honor it was for his father, whom I met only once, briefly, in the corridors of that New York Public Library. It's no exaggeration to say that this book, and really my second book, were written in the New York Public Library. So the work that Vartan Gregorian did, leaving aside his careers at Carnegie and at Brown University, if a single man had only done what he did, managed to do to really shore up the New York Public Library during one of its darkest periods and breathe new life into it and make it the shining more than a landmark, but a landmark center of scholarship and writing and reading, is an incredible tribute. So it's a particular honor for me to be in this beautiful building. I can attest. I was shocked at its beauty coming in the sunlight. It's a gorgeous building. So maybe you're here to partake in the architectural wonders of this building. Henry Morgenthaus Sr. He was never senior in his lifetime. He was Henry Morgenthau. And to the Democratic Party, he was Uncle Henry. And this book, as Mark said in his great introduction, is a big book. It's over 900 pages long. And the biggest problem is not the length. The biggest problem are so many Henrys. Many of you may have known Henry III. Henry Morgenthau III lived nearby in Cambridge, and I got to know him as well when I first started this journey. I'm going to speak very briefly about sort of three topics on Henry Sr. Henry as the power broker, Henry at the top of his game, Henry really in his prime, and then the Henry Morgenthau that I think most of you know, and certainly most Armenians I've ever met, know as Henry Morgenthau, the witness. And then lastly, I'm going to try something very different. So bear with me as we do some time travel, assuming the technical difficulties permit. And I'm going to try to talk about Henry Morgenthau and his character. Those are the three acts, as it were, of this talk. And then I want to be sure to leave time for now, 6 questions. Okay, so this is, we don't know the exact date here. And folks on Zoom are seeing these slides. I want to be sure. Yep, okay, great. We don't know the exact date. It's probably 1903 or 1904. And you should all be able to see a couple of things. I teach a class in visual literacy. You probably notice the straw hat, which is the reason why this book, this photograph is not in the book, because the photo editor said, no, he looks silly in that straw hat. And as a second image, this is on a glass negative from the Library of Congress, which is why you can see the handwriting on the top. The second image, which is, I assume it's the second image, we don't know because they're glass images, is in the book where he's taken off the straw hat and it's at his side. They decided that was more dignified. But I love this image for one reason. If you read it, you obviously see the cobblestones and you see the men working in the background and you see horses. We don't know for certain, but there's probably somebody who could do an investigation on this. They now call it open investigations. And you could probably definitively say what I have a hunch, that this is Longacre Square, now known as Times Square. And he's clearly standing, as he did quite often, for a formal portrait that was going to be in the press, most likely in the New York Times, a very large portrait, which was owned by his good friend Adolph Ochs, at a moment in his life when he's achieved something. This is a landmark portrait, and there's a series of them, as I said, at the Library of Congress. He's looking straight in the camera, and he's saying, I've arrived. It's not a hubris or ego. In fact, he's really quite moderately. Those of you who dipped into the book, no. He created Times Square. It was Longacre Square, and it was a center for stables. This crossroads, then as now of New York, was the biggest open air stables in Manhattan. He's at the, I'm going to see if I can move it. He is at the prime of his life there, 55 years old. This is where he came from. He's actually not in this picture. He wasn't born yet. He's born the year after. This is 1855. We do know it because the gentleman in the middle, who is full of ego and hubris and arrogance, Lazarus Morgenthau, wearing his cravat, wearing his famed Prince Alfred frock there, and his adoring but long-suffering wife, Babette Morgenthau, née Guggenheim, is seated I've lost track how many there are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Don't forget the baby. 7, 8. Henry's the 9th of what will be 14 children. 2 die in infancy. 1 is born in Brooklyn. Henry's born the next year, as I said. He's the 9th of 14. This is Lazarus, his father, at his prime. It's a beautiful, I don't know if this is an etching or an engraving, but in the background, you can see he's got images of defaults in southern Germany. This is actually in his mansion in Mannheim, which I'm told still stands. He is the master of a series of cigar making factories, 3 factories, 1,000 people working for him. And long story short, we're going to do some time traveling, as I promised you. He loses it all. Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, slapped on tariffs. Lazarus lost it all and came to New York with only the proceeds of this mansion, having sold it. His son rises from the ashes of the ruins of his father. Lazarus tried many things. He was quite inventive. He had a genius for philanthropy. He had a genius for inventing all kinds of somewhat useless, somewhat nonsensical items like the tongue scraper, like pine needle cigars. Lazarus never recovers after 30 years in New York and dies a pauper. His son, however, Henry, does exceedingly well. 1903, about the same time as that image on Longacre Square. This is the opening of the Broad Exchange, otherwise known today as the New York Stock Exchange. You can't quite make him out, but that's on the stage here. I don't want to leave the camera. You will see J.P. Morgan. And I know this because this was written about in every newspaper in New York. And at that time, there were more than a dozen dailies, but also across the country. And this is a photograph from the archives of the stock exchange. I went down there and it was a great afternoon digging through the archives there. This is also a beautiful photograph. J.P. Morgan came in late, unfashionably late, and he came in with his overcoat on. For some reason, every article talked about him coming in with his overcoat on his arm. Everyone stopped. Everyone looked at him. He rose to he walked all the way through and sat in the front row. 10 seats down from J.P. Morgan was Henry Morgenthau. And Henry noted it in his diary. This is a man and this is a family who recorded almost everything. There were more than millions and millions of documents that one could go through as I began this journey. But with that money, he had made in real estate in New York, at the age 55, he decides it's not enough just to worship at the altar of capital. I've made my money. It's time to go in, as he said it, public service. And that's the epigraph to the book. He says to his grandson, Robert Morgenthau, the future DA of New York City, he says, you have an opportunity to go into public service. I had to wait till I was 55. You don't, and it's a privilege, meaning do it. Here's Henry literally on the big stage for the first time in terms of politics. He's moving from finance into the world of politics. It's difficult to make it out. I couldn't find the original negative in this case, but that's Woodrow Wilson to Henry's right, the then governor of the state of New Jersey. People still remember President Woodrow Wilson, but very few Americans realize that he had been governor of New Jersey for 1 term, 2 years. And he was absolutely a dark horse long shot for the White House. This is the meeting where Henry turns to Woodrow Wilson. He's seated at the place of honor in April 1911, when Wilson was already sort of on the hustings. And he was on the hustings in an unusual way in America. He was going to Germans, to Poles, to Jews. And it was the beginning, I learned, of retail identity politics in America. Henry Morgenthau turns to Wilson and says, if you're going to really run for president, I'll back you, because there are 2 other men on either side who are also thinking about running for the White House at the same time. And that night, he says, I'll back you to Wilson and I'll raise money for you. And that's exactly what Henry did. He raised so much money. He used to joke that I bought the Democratic Party for $20,000. In fact, I think, and I state in the book, it was probably much more than that. He became, as he had done in real estate, with the syndicate, becoming the first real estate mogul to do what was called syndication. He was a great syndicator. In politics for the Democratic Party, he becomes the first bundler, something that we're very familiar with today. He would call up 10 of his friends and say, you have to put in this much, this is what I'm putting in. He also did something which was radical for the time, which appealed to Wilson and the progressives. He said, we will not take money from Wall Street. Henry Morgenthau was a real estate man. He was a finance guy, but he was never a Wall Street financier. He was always for the city of New York, not Wall Street, not those who came in with rapacious greed. And they were his enemies. That made him very fast allies with Wilson. And they started something radical, a campaign where you could give across the country, buying small tickets, no more than $100. As you know, it's exactly what Barack Obama did. And it was considered radical then. Henry did so well as chairman of the finance committee. He's rewarded with a post that he didn't want. He wanted to be secretary of the treasury, which of course is the post that his son gets from FDR. Here he is in his office in Constantinople. He was given what was then called the Jewish seat. Oscar Strauss, on the Republican side, had already been the ambassador to the Sublime Porte, as Turkey was then known. Henry didn't want it. He looked up to Oscar Strauss in about every way imaginable. He had more money, he had more stature. The Goldmans and the Saxes and the Strausses had all come to New York 20, 30 years ahead of the Morgenthaus. They saw Henry Morgenthau as an upstart. And Oscar, of course, had also been Secretary of the Commerce under Teddy Roosevelt. He had actually been the first Jewish cabinet member. He didn't want the Jewish seat, but everyone around him, including the Jewish leaders of New York, and most importantly, Woodrow Wilson, said, go to Turkey, as you know, I don't need to remind this audience, on behalf of your co-religionists, meaning the Hebrews, meaning the Jews, because Palestine was under the Turkish mandate. So if you wanted to do something for the Jews of Palestine, Constantinople was the place to do it. He basically grudgingly goes. And when he arrives, he's without his wife and he's overwhelmed. For the first time in his life, he's an outsider again. He came to New York at age 10, not speaking a word of English. Now he's in Constantinople and he's among real royalty, real aristocrats, dukes, duchesses, sirs and madames, and they all speak the lingua franca of the diplomatic corps, of course, was French. He doesn't speak a word of French. He speaks very good German, his native tongue. And he's lost without his wife and he's overwhelmed. And his diaries from that time are extraordinary to read because he has all this money and he has no sense of what he's supposed to do there. He befriends the three young men known commonly as the Young Turks. He actually becomes pretty close to them, Talat, Enver, and Jamal Pasha. And in conjunction with them over long dinners, teas, horseback riding along the Bosphorus, he was a great rider, he devises a plan which is equal parts the Turkish plan and equal parts Henry Morgenthau's plan that, well, what am I going to do with my time here? He was always trying to learn something and he could never sit still. He had built half of Upper Manhattan. He had built most of the Bronx. What was he going to do in Constantinople? He was going to go on a series of trips, long trips, 2 or 3 months at a time. And first of all, he was going to be going to Palestine, to the Holy Land. It was going to be a long trip by sea and then over land, at times by horseback. And then he was going to have a second trip. He was going to go into the interior throughout Anatolia. And then at some point later in the year, he was going to take the Baghdad Railway all the way to Baghdad. And this was in large part the Turkish design. The last 2 trips, of course, didn't happen. He enjoyed going through the Holy Land, and I don't know how to see it, and I'm worried about trying to zoom in, so I won't. This is in Jerusalem at the American consulate. He's there with his wife at the center, several members of the consular staff from Constantinople. But the gentleman with the beard, the silvery beard, right in the center of the doorway is Archbishop Shmavonian, who was known as his dragoman, his translator. Shmavonian deserves a place in the Hall of Fame at the State Department, the United States State Department. He had already served more than a decade in Constantinople as the ambassador's translator. As you can see, he was no ordinary translator. He traveled with Henry Morgenthau wherever he went. He greeted him at the train station in Constantinople when he first arrived. He made sure that the ambassador knew what needed to be known, whether it was from friends, confidants, or word on the street. He also knew that the ambassador saw the people he needed to see, and when the worst came, he made sure that those who needed to see the ambassador saw him. Archbishop Shmavonian is an amazing character in this whole story. He's on almost every page of Henry Morgenthau's diaries. He's in a lot of the consular material that is preserved in the National Archives at the State Department, and he is truly an unsung hero. These are not the guns of August, but by August 1914, the ambassador's daughter and grandchildren and son-in-law arrive from America. They come by ship. The 2-year-old on that ship is Barbara Tuchman. Many of you will recognize the name. Barbara Tuchman wrote the great book, The Guns of August. She was only 2 years old at the time in August 1914, but her whole life, she remembered it. This is actually a photograph of a skirmish in the Dardanelles. We don't know yet what, but I imagine that at some point, a historian who comes after me will figure it out. These are photographs most likely taken by his son-in-law from aboard ship, because this is a series of negatives that are among the ambassador's voluminous archive at the Library of Congress. There's a series of negatives here. He kept everything from his time in Constantinople because he knew then, well, we now know, it was on the knife edge of history. Constantinople, as opposed to what he imagined being relegated to the Jewish seat, stuck in the middle of nowhere, which is in part what his wife Josephine had worried about. He is the key guy at the right moment. He is in Constantinople first when one mission after another leave. He no longer is just the American ambassador. He takes on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 missions. And by the fall of 1914, he's taking on 9, and soon it grows to 13. So ambassadors are fleeing from Constantinople. I mentioned that he was very close to Enver Pasha, Jamal, and Talat. On the very night that Rafi was mentioning, this is the famous cable. This is actually the original. I got it from the National Archivist, no less, because I saw that Samantha Power had it on Twitter, and I asked, where did Samantha Power get it? And she said, well, I got it from the National Archives. This is the original. You can even see the staples marks of that cable, July 16th, 1915. But on April 24th, 1914, Ambassador Morgenthau was actually having dinner with Talat. And Shmavonian and others, there was another gentleman, Andolian, who was also a consular officer, had warned him that the worst is coming and will come. They will come for the cultural elite, the writers, the doctors. And he puts it to Talat that night. What are you going to do about the Armenians? And that begins a series as I go through in the book. And I'm pleased to see that readers whether you're looking for the story of the DA or the Central Park jogger, are coming to it and learning for the first time. I just spoke at the U.S. Treasury in Washington about Henry Morgenthau Jr., the Secretary of the Treasury under FDR, and his role during the Holocaust. But that many readers are also coming to it and learning really about the Armenian genocide for the first time. And that, of course, is exactly to the point of Henry Morgenthau, the ambassador, as witness. I won't read it because Rafi already read it, but it's a remarkable document. And when you read that for the first time, when I was actually able to hold it in my hands, it's at the same time blood-curdling, but also heartening that somebody in the United States government is standing up and saying that this is reports of eyewitnesses, race extermination. 1915, Raphael Lemkin, as I'm sure you all know, the cognate genocide doesn't come until 1943, but if it had existed, it would have been in this cable. And most importantly, he adds, this shows something to what I'm going to talk about in a moment, his character under pretext of reprisal against rebellion. Because if you were only to read Henry Morgenthau's diaries or his memoirs, he wrote several memoirs which were all ghostwritten. There's a kind of retrospective gilding. There's a burnishing of the resume, that he was always against it, that he knew, that he had foreseen it. In fact, not just the Turks, but his very close friend, the German ambassador, Baron von Wangenheim, who was the epitome, the embodiment of German Prussian militarism. He himself wasn't Prussian, but he was as good at it. He was a giant of a man. And Henry says, I've never met anyone so impressive. All of these various esteemed dignitaries repeated what the Turkish officials were telling him. An act of reprisal, meaning the Armenians are a threat. This is national security. We've had mobilization. I'm not going to bore you running through the whole chronology of the war, but it was a series of gradual escalations. And you look back, as I did, and you think, well, surely Henry should have known better. And we're going to get to that, because he didn't know better, not at first. This is Henry right in the middle of a very packed crowd on the steps. Some of you may have been there. I think it's now a hotel. This is in the Para. The building still exists intact. This was Palazzo Corpi, the first the first building really overseas that the United States owned as a diplomatic mission. It was an absolutely gorgeous place. Henry, as I mentioned, he was overwhelmed when he first arrived in Constantinople. Part of the reason was the Palazzo. It was a long way from even his elegant apartment in Manhattan. An enormous building, huge grounds, a full staff of servants. And these gentlemen who look like sailors down in front, they were in fact sailors. He had a 59-man crew, his own gunboat called the USS Scorpion. There's actually a small biography, a history book on the Scorpion. And this is at Christmas 1915. They look serious, but they don't look terribly shocked or sad. This is at the height of the deportations and what we now know were the death marches. And the reason why I picked this photograph tonight to show you is the gentleman on the far right of our screen who's staring at the camera and is very tall and standing apart from everyone else in the crowd, which is absolutely characteristic. That's Henry Jr. That's his son. Young man, very impressionable, absolutely taken with his father. His father was the sun god and an overbearing father. Henry Jr. was a struggler. He doesn't look it there necessarily, but as a young man, he had not finished boarding school, prep school he failed out of. He failed out of Cornell, not once, but twice. He tried He did try finance at his father's insistence. He tried being a construction foreman. He was nearsighted. He was in poor health. What he wanted to do was be a farmer. Because he had caught typhus as a young man, he had gone out to Texas. Again, his father orchestrated it, and he loved the open space and the ranch of Texas. What's he doing standing there on the steps of Palazzo Corpi? Well, he's visiting his father. And most of the history books say that Henry Jr. visited Turkey during the war. He actually went, not once, not twice, 3 times. Later in his own memoirs, he says, I visited Turkey once. And as I was speaking to someone earlier tonight, yes, he did tell FDR, I remember what happened to the Armenians, and I remember what my father did. I believe it's in, we were referencing the Ken Burns documentary. He certainly did go to Turkey, but the fact that he went 3 times was extraordinary. Henry Morgenthau was only there 28 months. And it's not like hopping on a flight and going to Istanbul today, which is in itself something of an ordeal, that he took ships across the Atlantic and then took a series of trains through 8, 9, 10 countries across Europe, and during World War I. His diaries from that period are extraordinary. So there he is on his 3rd and final trip. This I threw in just for fun because it's a beautiful document. And this is his diplomatic passport. He wasn't a member of the Foreign Service. This speaks to the power and the privilege of the family, that a young man who didn't graduate college, didn't graduate high school, who's really considers himself a farmer. In fact, he writes farmer. That was always on the line of occupation. What you did was he always said farmer. This is signed personally by the Secretary of the State. And as you can see, those are all the stamps from all the countries he crossed. I find it a beautiful document. And when you're talking about history, whether it's new or ancient, there you'll see Robert Lansing. We'll be talking about him in a minute. The lawyer who became the lawyer from upstate New York, who by dint of hard work and marriage becomes the Secretary of the State of the United States after William Jennings Bryan in midstream. Henry wasn't just there to hang out and have fun. He really wanted to do something. He was worried about his father. They had been exchanging letters constantly, sometimes 2 letters in a single day. And Henry did have sisters. He had 2 sisters, but the father, as I said, was not only overbearing and oppressive, he only cared that he literally said, let me take the boy, I'll handle the boy. And that's what he tried to do. There's Henry on the far left, a funny looking hat. And some of you may know these are Turkish uniforms. And this is Gallipoli. These are the trenches at exactly the time when Gallipoli becomes Gallipoli that we all know from the history books and the movies. Gentleman with the right that looks a little bit like Peter Sellers in a 1970s movie with the big bushy mustache, that's Bedri Bey. He wasn't the prefect. I think he was one of the police chiefs of Constantinople. He's there to keep an eye on Junior. And father seconded him. Father said, you only go down to the trenches if you go with them, basically a police escort. And that's what they did. He's got his water bottle. He had a camera because I have the negatives. This is, in fact, a photo from his camera. And he wasn't just going on a sightseeing tour. He really wanted to get into the trenches. And this is, we're not going to spend a lot of time on Junior tonight, but this is typical of Henry Jr. He was not a bookish guy. He didn't read long reports. He probably had undiagnosed dyslexia. He couldn't speak in public. He was a great prevaricator, a hand-wringer, but he loved to be where the action was. In fact, he had incredible courage and physical ability. He was a gifted athlete. He was a great horseman, and he loved to fly. FDR hated flying. And then there are these wonderful notes back and forth. FDR says, Henry, don't fly, take the train. And I would ask people, including his son, Henry III, why is FDR always worried about Junior? He said, oh, because he was reckless. At one point, he flew a crop duster himself without knowing how to fly. And there he is. It's a real act of rebellion against his father. But he wants to see for himself, not just who are these Turks, but who are these Germans? And as I write in the book, without giving away too much of one of the great discoveries, he actually is celebrating. He's toasting New Year's Eve to the Kaiser with the Germans, and the Turks are his escorts. This is not the Morgenthau family that generally we've come to know from history. But most importantly, when they leave, father and son, in February 1916, to go back to New York, this is actually at the train station in Constantinople. There is Archduke Schmavonian on the right. His beard's gotten a little bit grayer. Note it's hard to see in this photograph, but the bowler hats and the coats, because when they arrive, in the magic of PowerPoint, they arrive in New York Harbor. There they are again. And you better be sure that Papa's going to emerge from the boat first. Junior is behind him. If you're really interested, there's actually a video of this. It's film on YouTube. It's also on the Library of Congress website. It may be on the Holocaust Museum as well. It's only about 16 seconds long, because there were cameras everywhere. There were 2 motion picture cameras. There were over 50 photographers, and there was organized by the mayor, a big crowd of people to greet Henry Morgenthau. Why? Well, as I mentioned, Henry worked every room. He knew everyone, and the people that owned the New York Times were his close and oldest friends. But that's not why they were there. This is more of the family gathering right there at the pier in Lower Manhattan. They were there because now Henry Morgenthau, thanks to those 2.5 years in Constantinople, is no longer Henry Morgenthau, the real estate man. He comes back to America, and he's now Henry Morgenthau, witness to mass murder. He's now Henry Morgenthau with an incredible, what he had lacked when he left. He now has tremendous moral stature and moral authority. He still has money, but he now has moral authority, and he dives right back into politics. This is 1917. The gentleman in the middle who looks like Teddy Roosevelt is in fact Teddy Roosevelt. The gentleman that too few Americans, I think, know is Charles Evans Hughes on the far left. He may look like your childhood vision of Scrooge, I don't know. He was a very principled Republican, also from upstate New York, made it his own way, becomes governor of New York, becomes assistant justice of the Supreme Court, and resigns to run in 1916 against Woodrow Wilson, who was running for re-election, of course. Henry runs the re-election campaign. Wilson, of course, is re-elected. This is about the gentleman on the right in the gray suit, the boy Meier, used to be an infamous character in New York history. John Poroy Mitchell, he was called the boy mayor because he was one of the youngest mayors at the time. And this is Henry, uncharacteristically head bowed, but here's in the newspaper, again, across the country, on the steps of City Hall, leading what was called a fusion campaign. This is Henry's idea. He's using his money, his wherewithal, his own resources, but he also has new stature coming back from Turkey, and he's going to use it. He's uniting disparate factions. He's uniting people that not only didn't get along, may not even have been speaking to one another at this time. And that's really something unusual in New York politics and in American politics at the height of progressivism. Again, it was because, as I argue, of the Armenians. He had a reception when he left for Constantinople, and he had a huge buffet. It's hard to see it, a huge gala dinner. He's at the far end, at the head of the table in center stage. He was always on center stage. And this is the Armenian Association in New York, fading him for having spoken out. But of course, he wasn't done. In fact, he was really only beginning. There's a line that it took me a long time to realize the genius of Henry Morgenthau. Yes, he did speak out and he stood witness, to the mass murder of a nation from Constantinople. But while he was in Turkey, he organized in New York. First, it was called the Committee of Armenian Atrocities. It grows into several, it morphs into several different committees, the American Committee for Relief in the Near East. This is Henry Morgenthau's work. He was the prime mover of it. He didn't give all the money. He proposed a few harebrained schemes at one point with Teddy Roosevelt wanted to send American troops into Turkey. No one was going to do that. Henry said, well, I'll put up $1 million and we can move Armenians out to the unpopulated lands out west in America and in Alaska. Of course, that didn't happen. And that was actually very early on in the mass deportations. But what he does do is he gets together those old friends from his real estate years. And he also, people like John D. Rockefeller, he also draws on his new allies whom he had only made common cause with in Turkey. And for a German Jew who made his money in real estate to be hanging out with people like Cleveland Dodge and Francis Sayre and people who were essentially wealthy missionaries who saw it as their mission to proselytize, not just in Turkey among the Armenians, but throughout what was known as the Near East. Henry comes to them, and in John D. Rockefeller's headquarters in Lower Manhattan, they form this committee to raise money for Armenian relief. It wasn't just about raising money, though. It was about an incredible activist campaign on publicity. One of the greatest propaganda campaigns with the help of the British ambassador, whom he had also come to know on that trip to the Holy Land, James Bryce. They go on international tour. They make movies, they write books. There are articles in constant newspapers. And that raises awareness. It was, of course, too little, too late. But that is essentially his greatest legacy, is that he was known not only as the ambassador, but the great spokesman and the great advocate. And not just for the Armenians, but also here he is in 1919. He becomes almost an ambassador at large. It was a very modern idea. I mean, we now, since I guess, I don't know when it started, the 1960s, 70s, Jimmy Carter, Senator Richardson, you know, you would be sent off on a goodwill mission or maybe on an investigation or maybe to free hostages. That's what Henry becomes. He becomes the go-to guy, in this case, to go investigate allegations of mass persecution of the Jews in Poland. This is, here he is with American officers in the 1919 mission. And here he is in, here he is in Athens with Greek orphan boys. And he was then sent by the League of Nations to help after the burning of Smyrna. Hundreds of thousands of Greeks also thank Henry Morgenthau as well. And I got an email from one Greek woman in Greece who said, I celebrate his birthday as my second birthday. These missions, these overseas missions, were really his second legacy after having made so much money in New York. It's what really mattered the most to him. But he always had to worry about Junior. What is my son going to be? And that really became his, it was always his focus, but as he got older, it was his primary focus. The gentleman in the middle, who already was suffering from polio, this is 1931, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is actually not far from here, on the coast of Massachusetts. It must have been a hot day in the middle of summer. They don't look it, though. Again, this is for the press. Henry was a master at publicity. And the gentleman to Henry's right, second from the left, it's easy if I go that way, is the inimitable Colonel House, who had been the consigliere to Woodrow Wilson, FDR, 2 senators from Massachusetts, and the great mayor of Boston, I think James Michael Curley was mayor for about 75 years. I'm making that up. I think it was at least 35. And these are power brokers, but it's an unusual combination and it's a rare photograph. because they're power brokers of two different generations. And these are Woodrow Wilson people. These are aging progressives. Roosevelt didn't see himself as a New Dealer. There was no New Deal in 1931. He saw himself as a Wilson man. And who took on the mantle of the Wilson men? None other than Henry Morgenthau. He actually incorporated the Wilson Foundation. He helped build the Wilson Library. He led the Wilson Fellowships. He endowed it. And again, here he is, not just raising money, but raising money with a purpose and bringing people together. In this case, unifying the Democratic Party in 1931. For that gentleman, FDR. He had actually known FDR since 1912. In the Baltimore Convention, he had been a delegate on behalf of Wilson, and he was a great talent spotter, and he saw F.D. Roosevelt, and he made a note in his diary, must keep an eye on him. And FDR, when he introduces himself to the farmer, who actually becomes a very good farmer at Fishkill Farms in Dutchess County, where FDR, not coincidentally, also had a farm, more of an estate than a farm. And that's how FDR and Henry Jr. meet as early as 1914. For decades, they are very close friends. And then FDR wins the governorship, of course, and takes Henry to Albany with him. As an old man, he's now Ambassador Morgenthau wherever he goes. He had turned down several opportunities. The Turks were quite serious about inviting him to be their finance minister. He never got exactly what he wanted. He wanted to be the Treasury Secretary. And what he really thought when he saw FDR, whom he had known, as I said, for decades, and whose career he had encouraged, he saw a man who could win the White House and take on his son, Jr. And that's, of course, exactly what happened. It's a little bit more complicated than that. It probably covers 100 pages in the book. But once Jr. becomes the Treasury Secretary, Henry's job is done. There's no record of Henry Morgenthau ever telling his son in the White House, or whether he was also at every opportunity he would come to the White House. There's no record of him saying, "Remember the Armenians." He didn't need to. And it was a matter of Henry Jr. having been in those trenches, having been 3 times to Constantinople, and having traveled and having met not just the Turkish officers and the German officers, he also met many, many Armenians. His mother, Josephine Morgenthau, worked, and I talk about it and describe it in detail. She volunteered and worked with Armenian hospitals and orphanages and schools and colleges. This was a great part of their time in Constantinople. Power broker, player, witness, moral authority. Doesn't still tell you who Henry Morgenthau really was. It's what he did. And that's why I want to just briefly conclude by talking about his character. Here he is as a young man. He actually had to withdraw from college. As I mentioned, Lazarus did not succeed in New York. He flamed out rather fantastically. And Henry, of all those children, suffered the most. He had to quit City College. He went to Columbia on his own dime, Columbia Law School, and he became a lawyer before he became a real estate magnate. This has very little to do with the Morgenthau family, but I thought you needed a color slide. I've done a lot of talks. I've never spoken on the Armenians, and I've never done a PowerPoint. So this is Socrates and Alcibiades. I had lunch with a friend recently, and he said, well, it's all about character. The whole family, down to this day, is about character. It's not about coincidence. Bob Morgenthau, the DA, used to say, well, my success is all about luck and longevity. I actually think it's about character. And so Socrates, as some of you may know, has a debate, more than one, with Alcibiades, who may or may not have been his lover, who's this most beautiful man in Athens, much younger, much stronger, much richer. And yet he's a bit of, as it was described to me, who knows nothing about Greek philosophy, that he was a bit of a sociopath. And he's really the reason why Athens falls. And Socrates says, I tried to teach him, but you can't teach a man to be virtuous. So the question with Henry Morgenthau is a man born with virtue? And I really don't know the answer. But when I go through, as I did, and I hope I never have to again, millions and millions of microfilm documents, as I said, he kept everything. In the Library of Congress and in Hyde Park, the FDR library, you see things that look like this, hundreds of pages like this. This is just one. And it's anything but ordinary. This is a young boy coming from Germany in Brooklyn. He went to public school about 2 blocks from where I live, and he's writing by rote. And he writes and writes and writes. And he's always doing what he was told, and he's doing not more, he's doing 100 times more than he had to do. He never loses his German accent. He tries hard. As a young boy, he reads Ben Franklin. He reads Emerson. He falls in love with the transcendentalists. Here's a German Jewish kid in the New York City public schools, surrounded by Irish and Italians, immigrant children, and he reads Ben Franklin. I don't know if you can see this. This is 26 virtues and vices. That's a complete ripoff, copy, mimic, imitation of Ben Franklin. He narrows it down. He was 16 when he wrote that. By the time he's 26, by the time he's 17, he narrows it. No, he increases it. This is 26 virtues and vices. And each day, I won't bore you with the details, but just to give you a glimpse, each day he records. Was he swearing? Was he arrogant? Did he exhibit avarice? He keeps a moral register on himself. He also keeps track of every penny his brothers and sisters take from him and that they owe him. He tracks everything. He then even has it typed up. At this point, he's down. Now he's 19 years old. He whittles it down to 13, and that was Ben Franklin's. As many of you know, that was Ben's magic number. Not only his 13 virtues to live by. This becomes his rules, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. Unfortunately, I kind of wish I hadn't put this in the book. I think it's only one line, but it's the line everyone remembers from this period. This is the page from Henry's diary when he's ranking women, potential fiancés. And luckily, for the family's sake, there's Josie Sykes, his future wife, who has 3 checks. She's the only woman, I think, who gets 3, so she wins. These are ranked. This is only one page of many. I think there's over 400 names. It's not just 25 names. He's scouring New York and tracking them. This is, as someone who saw this said, "Oh, you mean Facebook?" And he has 2 versions of classification. This is alphabetical, but then he also has them ranked by points. I'll spare you the details. This is his obsession. He's quantifying everything not just for him, not just for his own material well-being, but really for a moral well-being. Who is most virtuous and who will bring my family to its fruition? Who can take us to the heights of power and culture and society? And that's exactly where he goes. Time travel. This is actually a White House dinner. Gentleman in the middle. I met a Argentinian today. Maybe you would recognize, I don't know. He's actually the Argentine finance minister. He has nothing of interest in this image. What's interesting, and it's not even classified as such, that's the Treasury Secretary looking as he always did. Roosevelt called him Henry the Morgue. He looked scared, deer in the headlights. Why, I don't want to be photographed like this for whatever reason. But behind the waiter, lurking as they're serving the coffee and the dessert, you recognize him. There's the old ambassador, lurking, just ready to pounce, making sure that everything is going according to plan, as it did. This is also an integral part of his character. You probably won't recognize these gentlemen. There's Henry on the left, and there's Josephus Daniels. when I had finished the manuscript, and it was during COVID, the book was much longer. I gave it to several historian friends who very kindly stopped me from my blundering. And one historian said, you got to get rid of Josephus Daniels. That's Josephus Daniels, the gentleman in the middle. Well, he was the Secretary of Treasury under Wilson. I can't get rid of him. Well, you better put some words around Secretary of the Navy, because he's a revere in the South. In certain circles, he's revered. He becomes obviously, maybe not obviously, a newspaper man. I think it's the newspaper in North Carolina, the Raleigh News Observer. His son was the editor of it. It's a great legacy. He was also a raving, open racist and something of an anti-Semite. They don't look like they're arguing there. Josephus Daniels had worked on the Wilson campaign. I mentioned the German ambassador, who was not Prussian, but he might as well have been. This is a letter to Henry Morgenthau in his papers from the German ambassador, Wangenheim, it was his show. Constantinople was his show, and Henry was an interloper, a rank amateur. And he's writing him and he's thanking, my dear colleague, I thank you for your protection. Is it Tabriz? Yeah, I think Tabriz, modern day Iran, if I'm not, for your protection. Henry must have done something through the American consular circuit to give protection, or maybe it was through passage on the train for the German. Now that's 1914 in November. This is January, same year, but Henry has just arrived. That's the postcard in the German. It's very difficult even for a native German speaker to read it because of the Gothic script. But Henry, in his archives, this is what he does. He has people type it out and actually translate and then type and then replicate in English. Kind greetings from the paradise of horses, Dublin. Wait a minute. They're in Turkey. You read something like this and your eyes are blurred and you can't read anymore, and you're near blind in the some bowels of some archive. Kind greetings from the paradise of horses. I found several. They may suit you. I'll probably bring you two for selection. Power, privilege, and the rise of an American dynasty. This is the German ambassador picking out horses in Dublin to take to Constantinople for his new friend, Henry Morgenthau. This is not Wangenheim that you read in the Morgenthau diaries. So, a couple more and then we're done. This is Father Coughlin. My editor couldn't believe it. He said, wait a minute, when he read an early draft. Fantastic editor, Andy Ward at Random House. What's Henry Morgenthau doing at a rally in 1933 in the middle of Manhattan with Father Coughlin, who's not only a raving anti-Semite, but is an anti-Roosevelt America firster? What are they doing making common cause? Horses from Dublin, a rally in the middle of Manhattan. And then in 1938, the very first meeting, I think, at the White House, as was mentioned a few times tonight, the beginning of relief and rescue mission, too little, too late. This is before Kristallnacht, when it should have become obvious and plain to see to all. This is Henry, again, center stage, unmistakable, always in the middle, always with his eye on the camera. Rabbi Stephen Wise, who is the leader of the Reform communities of New York, the man who knew more about Hitler than anyone in the US government at the time. George Messersmith is to the right with his hat in hand. Messersmith had actually met Hitler. And then, as you can probably tell, a whole bunch of Protestant, Catholic, monsignors, reverends, bishops, and in the back, unfortunately relegated, the great Frances Perkins, she's actually the only cabinet member there, Frances Perkins. And the gentleman who then becomes head of Roosevelt's early relief work, James G. McDonald, who's another extraordinary character from American history. the League of Nations High Commissioner, is not there, but he chaired this. This again is Henry bringing together disparate factions, different people for a common cause. That was part of his character. Most fundamentally, and we just have one more slide, this is Henry with his men. There were women in the family, and they are in the book. This is Henry, 89 years old. He dies the next year at a gala in their honor in 1945, November 7th. And that is Henry III, whom I mentioned, in his military uniform. He had served in Europe with General Patton. In the middle is Henry Jr., Secretary of the Treasury, who had just lost that year his closest friend, the president, FDR. And that is Bob Morgenthau in a Navy uniform, just returned after 54 months of active duty, an extraordinary war. He is still on active duty in this photograph. He didn't believe it, but I found out that actually his war, looking at his war archives, he only resigned got his orders after this photo was taken. 54 months, during which he was the exec commander, the #2 executive officer, 20 years old. His ship was sunk in the Mediterranean. 49 men lost their lives. And after that ship was sunk, he went on to the Pacific, to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and wave after wave of kamikazes. And when I met the DA in the spring of 2008, a long time ago now, he wanted me to know a few things about his family. And one of the things he wanted me to know was about the Armenians. And these are not his words. This is an editorial from the Daily News on that date, April 24th. These are his words. The courage to call genocide what it is. This, of course, was to President Obama, a man whom he greatly respected, a man whom he helped elect, a man whom he didn't nominate. She needed no nomination, but he certainly seconded and testified on her behalf. Sonia Sotomayor, who was Obama's first nominee for the Supreme Court. But Obama didn't do it, did he? And it wasn't until the current president, and when I speak about the Armenian genocide to people who really don't know the history, the one time I'm guaranteed to get a room full of heads shaking in disbelief is when I say that nobody in America in the White House called it genocide until this president. And that really speaks to something other than the character of the Morgenthaus. And I just want to wrap up by saying it's been an honor to speak here. It's been an honor to speak on something I knew very little about, myself being one of those ignorant Americans before I embarked on this journey, and especially to speak in a hall named after Dr. Vartan Gregorian. Thank you very much. And I hope I left room. Stop sharing, yeah?
We stopped sharing. Very good. Andrew, thank you so much for that talk and for your incredible work. And, you know, again, as I believe you yourself emphasized, your talk tonight more or less focused on Henry Morgenthau, Ambassador Morgenthau. There is a lot more in the book because it covers, I don't know, a century and a half or so of history and of several generations of the amazing Morgenthau family. So even if you think you know about Ambassador Morgenthau, you'll learn things about him probably from reading this book, and you will undoubtedly learn much about his family and his successors. So thank you also to the Zoom audience. If you have questions, please post them in the Zoom Q&A. I think I can read them off of my phone. And if there are questions in this room. I see. Lerna.
But I plan reading it. My question is, I mean, I have many questions, but one of them is about the Shimabonian guy. And you might know the Turkish denialist historiography usually attributed whatever Morgenthau wrote pro-Armenian to this person. What did you find that's new that you can contribute to, if anything, to this debate, especially since you in passing mentioned that the memoirs are written by ghostwriters? Do you know from the diary and other sources who these ghostwriters are and for each specific book? What they wrote or where they come from? Or how much like Morgenthau had oversight? Or I assume from the obsessive personality, they had a lot, but the fact that it also doesn't fit too well that someone this obsessive would let his memoirs be written. Not that the Armenian part is only in the memoir, but you know, it's well, how do you make that sit together? The other one is maybe it's not your game and it's totally fine. But how did the family observe the fact that after this era and after 1923-24, when Turkey and the United States signed amicable, like they signed treaties, friendship treaties, right? After which the United States become pro-Turkish, slowly but surely. Did they try to, in any ways, intervene in this, given their prominence? And in that, maybe if you thought, is there any story about the Crane family, Richard Crane, who was also Wilson's guy?
Right.
Not necessarily anti-Armenian, but certainly pro-Turkish around it.
Right, absolutely. So I'll take them in reverse order. Crane, actually, I had a photograph in there, but I thought there were too many slides. Because most audience don't remember Charles Crane. And he's a very complicated, all your questions speak to one point. History matters and history is complicated. And I spent many months, to be honest, probably more than a year, trying to figure out who Charles Crane was. And his son, I believe it's his son, it might have been his grandson, authorized me, you needed personal authorization to go into the Crane papers, which are at Columbia. And I did, because I wanted to learn, again, it's about character. Somebody who's born with a lot of money, makes a lot of money. He was actually known as well, I won't get into too much detail. He was known as the plumbing king of Chicago. It was actually more pipes, but he also did toilets, depending on how you view Crane. He also met with Hitler, as I'm sure you know, sought out Hitler, and then wrote very favorably of Hitler. And yet he was also on that finance committee for Wilson. And he was somebody that Henry Morgenthau knew for decades and went back to make common cause, whether it was for money or for political will. Crane is a very and there's a wonderful biography of Charles Crane that came out. Many books came out while I was writing this. That was one of them, and I was thankful for it. The second question on post-1923 is a great question. I know nothing about it. I'm sure somewhere in all of my 20 boxes of Morgenthau material, there's an answer, but I don't think it's the answer. And I would be wary to guess, because I'm sure that too is a complicated history, but it deserves looking at. It's a great question. The first one I did look at. So Shimabonian is not a coincidental character. I didn't talk about it. He was there for a long time before he was the institutional memory, not just about the Armenians. He actually knew all the points of power personally. He had tremendous access and entree with Turkish officialdom and with the other embassies. He was more of a diplomat than anyone else in that grand palazzo. It wasn't just longevity there. He was extremely learned, spoke many languages, obviously was a translator, so he's always in the room. But he had the institutional memory that Henry, before he leaves, he goes to Washington, which I do describe in the book. And then the great Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, says the same thing Colonel Howe says, "You'll be fine." And Henry says, "Wait a minute, This sounds like a briefing today in the White House. Maybe Rafi's had a different experience at State. I don't mean to be facetious. I'm sure it has changed quite a bit. He's given this portfolio, which he doesn't want, and he finds out that basically the Turkish hands at State know nothing. So when he arrives, Smolonian hands him all the boxes, all the cable books. They kept obviously copies of the cables, and he reads and he studies. The first few weeks, his wife Josie is not there. He just reads and reads and reads, and that's what he was. He was a very quick study. So Smolonian, from the very beginning, is a welcome and important tutor. He's really tutoring him long before the memoirs come. He's tutoring Henry. So the memoirs could be a topic for their own lecture. And just very briefly, I did extensive digging to try to find out who, and I did find out who wrote which memoir with him. It was something he always did. And actually, it was Henry III, who lived here in Cambridge, said, you know, I don't know why my grandfather didn't write his own memoirs, because when you look at the drafts I have, he was actually a very good writer. He didn't, it's about character, about being that young boy outsider in New York City, writing ordinary. He didn't believe that he could write well. He actually wrote very well. He always spoke with a German accent. He wrote in German too, but he was very leery of writing his own memoirs. And if you have the money, why not hire the best? And he did. He hired absolutely the best, as his son did. It's one of the threads of the book. That said, we also have his original diaries, which, as I pointed out, it wasn't just a Wagenheim postcard that were typed up. His diaries he had typed up. So those, again, this happened too late for me, but not for you. They're online. His individual diaries, he has at least 3 sets of diaries. It's not just the diary that he sort of dictated at night, almost every night. He also has diary books that he kept for decades, and they're beautiful because he wrote, it was an example of one of them. He writes on the same day over many years. It's a beautiful way to write. So Thursday all the way down over 5 years. And they're miniature. I mean, yeah, you can go blind reading this stuff. So I was able, not entirely to fit the mosaic together, but that's when I see that he's having dinner with Talat on April 24th. It's not from the diaries that were published. And I had to be very careful with that, obviously, because of this controversy. It's not quoting dialogue from the diaries. It's from the contemporaneous accounts, whether they be in notes. Sometimes it's a trait that his son did. They were so nervous going in, as one might be when you go see a potentate. You make notes before and after, and those notes you can decipher if you know what they're talking about. And there are notes. The most important one, of course, is Alma Johansson. They exist. So Alma Johansson is a Swedish nun who ran the orphanage, German orphanage in Mush, and it not only should be a book, it is a book. Her testimony. That testimony, people have disputed it because it's in 2 different languages. It's in 2 different languages because Henry Morgenthau said, you speak German, go with my secretary and dictate it. And then it was translated into English as well. And I think it may also be published in Swedish. And of course, that's the famous report that Henry forwards to Lansing, the upstate lawyer. He's not one of my favorites. And with the enclosure saying, give this to the president, he needs to know. And Lansing adds the note saying, it's interesting, but you don't really need to read it. And there's no evidence that Wilson, it got to the desk, there's no evidence that Wilson ever read it. So these are very, very complicated and important questions. Thank you.
What was he doing with Father Coughlin?
So that was a very brief romance. Thank you for asking. Didn't want to leave you hanging. And Father Coughlin, for a time, well, for his whole life, as far as I know, was an opportunist. And for a time, he was warming to FDR because they were going off gold and they were buying gold. It was going off the gold standard. And that was pro-gold, anti-silver. So for a time, it suited Father Coughlin and his followers. That romance didn't last very long. Josephus Daniels, Charles Crane, those are long-term friendships and alliances. Wangenheim, no, brings him the horse, and they did go riding every morning. Henry loved to ride. Is a different story, because there in the memoirs, by the time you get to the second or third draft, Wangenheim becomes pure evil. He's the Prussian bear. And he wasn't pure evil. In fact, as I write in the book, Wangenheim is telling him, I've reported, he was very close friends to the Kaiser. I've reported back before the mass deportations come that there could be trouble with the Armenians. And in Germany, this was very, very, I don't know if it's well known, but it's fine-tooth history. Historians have focused on the German role and the devolution, not the evolution, the devolution of the German-Turkish alliance. And all of these, Charles Crane, Father Coughlin, the point about character is that as he did in real estate, as he did in New York politics, as he did in American politics, Henry could make alliances in service not only of his own cause, but a greater cause. And that's what those alliances speak to. They may not be pretty, and there's more of them in the book, but it was always to serve a greater cause.
You talked about and showed how subsequent generations, Henry III and Robert and other members of the Morgenthau family, have continued to care and advocate for Armenian causes. Why do you think that has continued for so long?
That's a great question. I think it also speaks to character, and they, not everyone, of course, but those members of the family that I've come to know don't take that legacy lightly. Yes, there's power. Various members of the family have held, if not public service, but a very high and terrific work in nonprofits, or in science, or in education, or in the arts. But when it comes to the Armenian genocide and the history of the Holocaust and the War Refugee Board, which was also, of course, too little, too late, I think the family and the name Morgenthau, if I hear it, not just in Los Angeles, but in Armenia, where I've been many times, or in Chicago, or people who write me from Sydney, there are, of course, unfortunately, Armenians everywhere. I mean, unfortunately, for the reason why the diaspora is global. The name Morgenthau, of course, is known. And for members, you know, if that happens to be your surname, you don't wear it lightly. Yeah. And I think that legacy, I know it continues.
Yes, Greg.
Yeah, so mentioning Henry III, became friends with me when as a fellow Princeton alum, we got involved in the editor chair when it was set up. He also wrote a book about the Morgenthaus, mostly Morgenthau. I was wondering if you care to compare and contrast your work with his.
Sure, thank you. And one of the great joys, it's bittersweet, but it's a joy, is that when I speak on the book, I feel his presence, especially here. I got to know Henry very well, and it's no exaggeration that there would be no book if the day I knocked on his door in Cambridge, he didn't greet me not just with incredible food, as you know. He liked to eat, and it was always a gourmet, organic, delicious meal. But he presented me the very first time we met. Here's an interloper into his family, not just his family history, but the family history that he spent decades researching and writing his own book. He brings me a stack of papers. They were actually already Xeroxed. The only time, actually, probably a decade of research that someone did this, and said, I want you to read through these. I said, well, are we going to have lunch? He said, yes, after lunch. And I sat in his house in Cambridge and I read those, and they are an extraordinary collection. Those are the letters that his father dictated, like his father, to his sons, to Henry III, and to the future DA, Bob, during the war. It's an extraordinary document. They could almost be published on their own as a chronicle of the war from the height of political power, from the Treasury, from the White House, up into April 1945, when he says, boys, let me tell you, because he's talking into what was called an Ediphone. It's a complicated machine, but it created an audio disc that then would be transcribed as letters, and he kept a copy. So that's where we have them. And he didn't seem to write his daughter, who was at home, as much. But writing the boys, he said, last night I saw the president for the last time. It was Roosevelt's last dinner in Warm Springs, Georgia. He was there, and he's writing the boys, talking it out, as you know, crazy people like me do all day long, talking into the phone. That's what he did. And Henry gave me those letters, and I said, oh, can I go to Kinko? I did go to Kinko's often, and I think it was Harvard Square, and you know, we did 3 or 4 machines going at once. He said, no, I made those for you. He gave me he had already made a copy, and these were unpublished. And yes, they exist in an archive, but to tell you where the gold is an amazing gift. And that was our first meeting of many, many meetings. And Henry was part coach, part instigator, prodder, keeping me along. And then I did have another career as a magazine writer, writing for the New York Times Magazine. And then my previous life, as Mark said very kindly in the introduction, was in Russia for 10 years for Time Magazine, and then for the New York Times Magazine. And when I would go to Russia and disappear for a few months during the course of this research, Henry was furious. Why are you going to Russia? You know, who cares about this? You know, why are you writing this? And then when the article came out, who was the first person to call saying, oh, this is big time. You know, this is going to be great. He was a great cheerleader. And as you know, a fantastic historian, not just of his family, but one of the founders of public television in America, to speak to the legacy of public service and public interest. And he wanted to read the book, you know, and that's the sadness for me. I saw him many times. Then when he moved to Washington, I got to see him again and again. He was particularly interested in the Armenians, but not just. And he would ask the questions like, are you going to take on this? He was always encouraging me to push it as far as I could. Don't just quote the Ghost Written, of which I said there are many memoirs. The fundamental difference between the two books is that it's 4 generations. And if you look at that, which speaks more to the, I think, sibling rivalry, there are about 2 paragraphs on the DA. So there was plenty of room. There was plenty of room there. Okay, is that it? Do we have time for?
So, yes,
You've
then
been patient.
what I would like to do is invite people here, encourage people here to purchase a copy of Andrew's wonderful book, which is for sale out there. And if you're watching on Zoom or YouTube, as people are, either drive over in the next couple of minutes or purchase it online, and we'll be happy to send it out to you. So please, hand for Andrew.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you all.